Okay, we're good. We can start.
Okay, thank you, Riste. So welcome everybody to the School for Materialist Research. This is the second session of the second series. The School of Materialist Research is an initiative of Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities in Skopje, of the Chair Architectural Theory and the Philosophy of Technics at the Technical University in Vienna. Also, the Design Academy in Eindhoven, the Netherlands, is participating. I am from Utrecht University. My name is Iris van der Tuin. I'm professor of theory of cultural inquiry, and I will be not only welcoming you, but especially welcoming our speaker, Jan Overwijk. Jan will be speaking today mainly from his PhD dissertation on rationalization, paradoxes of closure and openness. So Jan is a finishing PhD candidate at the Netherlands Institute for Cultural Analysis at the University of Amsterdam, and he's also a lecturer at Utrecht University in the Liberal Arts and Sciences program, as well as in the Department for Media and Culture Studies. Jan has published his work in Philosophy Today, actually in an issue that I edited together with Adam Nozak from Arizona State University. He's published in Boundary 2 and in Theory, Culture and Society. He's editor of Crisis, Journal for Contemporary Philosophy, which is a leftist, I would say, critical theory and STS journal. So Jan is a philosopher, a social philosopher, a political philosopher by training. And his teaching is not only done in that area, but he also teaches philosophy of science, but also courses on, for example, connective thinking and multi and interdisciplinarity. Jan is a media savvy person, a media savvy philosopher, an activist persona, I would say, and I would suggest to follow him on Twitter. His talk today is titled Cybernetic Rationalization from Artificial Life to Neoliberal Capitalism. I announced this to the liberal arts students as learning about the mirror maze that we call the university or institutions today. And I hope to learn about that indeed, the foundations, and maybe also how we can get out of it. The floor is yours, Jan. I look forward to your lecture. As I understood it, the lecture will be more or less 45 minutes, after which we have some 40 minutes for Q&A. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Iris. That's great. Thanks a lot for that. And thank you, School of Materialist Research, for inviting me and having me over. So yeah, I am going to talk about rationalization. I am going to read an adaptation from my dissertation, and just want to preface it briefly by saying maybe a little bit of some things about rationalization, what that actually is. So rationalization is a concept, of course, coined originally by Max Weber and then developed by the Frankfurt School. And they meant by it the proliferation of a kind of technical rationality throughout the social world, at the expense really of kind of a political openness that has the potential to resist capitalist modernity. So rationalization is the kind of totalizing motion of technical reason, and then closing into this kind of becoming a kind of totally closed system of administration, if you will. Equally, however, it's also a very paradoxical concept because as this kind of totalizing system becomes more technically almost nihilist, it actually starts to become politically a dominating force. So it sort of collapses from technology into politics as well. So I'm interested in tracking these kind of paradoxes, and that's what I'm going to be doing today. And I'm going to be talking specifically about actually the production process in capitalism. And yeah, so rationalization is technical reason, right? So the question could be, what then is technology, or what is this technical rationality? And trying to historicize that a bit, I try to think in terms of a kind of shift from thermodynamic rationalization, thermodynamic technology into cybernetic technology. So with thermodynamics, I'm not going to get really into that, but just know that that sort of refers to the kind of classical rationalization of Weber and the Frankfurt School. It's kind of totalizing reason that sort of closes off into perfect communicability, control, predictability, and so on. So cybernetics, of course, is the science of communication and information that started in the 1940s and that developed into other sciences as well, like complexity theory and chaos theory and artificial intelligence. So, and just as a short motto then, before I start reading, I'd like to give you this to keep in the back of your mind, maybe, that it's this kind of case where in the 1990s at the Santa Fe Institute, they had this program called Tierra, an artificial life program, where a biologist called Thomas Ray wanted to simulate life in a software program. And the way that he did that was by instituting a few simple rules, as he called it. So these were basically parameters that regulated what life was and what death was and what reproduction was and so on. So, and then he went to bed, he pressed play, and then he went to bed and he woke up and he found sort of an ecosystem of digital organisms with parasites and hyperparasites and everything that just kind of miraculously almost spawned or evolved unpredictably and contingently. So you got this kind of paradox between simple rules on the one hand and kind of complex behavior that cannot be really planned. And that's kind of what I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. All right, so I'll just start reading now. So yeah, when we think of production process and we think of rationalization, rationalization here has become almost synonymous really with Taylorism. And Taylorism must be placed within the kind of thermodynamic energy epistemology of the late 19th century. Taylorism views the shop floor as a kind of combustion engine that must be centrally designed, controlled, and systematized in order to attain perfect efficiency or the optimum use of energy, in Taylor's case measured in foot-pounds from a day's labor power. Taylorism institutes a rigorous division of labor in the production process, separating low-skilled executive tasks from high-skilled design and control tasks. The design of this work process abstracts from artisanal knowledges by, as Frederick Taylor writes, classifying, this is a quote, classifying, tabulating, and reducing this artisanal knowledge to rules, laws, and formulae. The resulting metrologies, which kind of measurement systems, these metrologies, then detail the work tasks in scientific descriptions, breaking them up into small repetitive motions that dehumanize and denigrate workers, turning them into basically lifeless robots. The Taylorist work philosophy thus explicitly attempts to ban informal rules and worker knowledge in order to control the escape of energy from the shop floor. Shovelers in a Taylorized factory, for instance, are commanded by supervisors to replace their natural shoveling styles with those styles calculated for efficiency through the science of shoveling. In this sense, Taylorism epitomizes rationalization as closure, the classical rationalization, a process that tends towards absolute control and optimal efficiency. Far from being a benevolent technocracy, Taylorism's rational division of labor creates, to quote Foucault on a similar topic, a universe of rules which is by no means designed to temper violence, but rather to satisfy it. The political force of violence cannot be driven out into the environment of the system by rationalizing this kind of system of instrumental technology. Politics and technology are rather paradoxically imbricated. So what happens to our understanding of rationalization if we try to unravel this paradox? Cornelius Castoriadis provides some preliminary answers. Pushing back against the classical Lukácsian visions of near total reification, which means the debasement of human relations into thing-like metrologies, Castoriadis states that, quote, reification, the essential tendency of capitalism, can never be wholly realized. Now, taken on its own, this is not yet a wholesale rejection of thermodynamic thought, but only a qualification of it. It still takes the incommunicable as an impassable region at the edges of reification, kind of focus imaginaries that may never be reached, but that can at least be approximated. The logic of totalization, however unsuccessful, remains intact. In an ecological gesture, however, Castoriadis takes it one step further. Society, he writes, must live with a double reality, distinguishing between an official version and a reality which are irreducibly opposed to one another. Rationalization or reification works through these two realities, the official and the unofficial, the written and unwritten, inside and outside. The latter must now no longer be thought of as this kind of passive playing field for the colonizing forces of instrumental reason, but rather as an active source of potentiality in the strangeness of capitalist reification. Capitalism, Castoriadis illustrates paradoxically, quote, can function only by continually drawing upon the genuinely human activity of those subject to it, while at the same time trying to level and dehumanize them as much as possible. He therefore arrives at an expression of a mode of rationalization without totality, a mode that functions fundamentally through paradox and incommunicable ecology. I'm taking ecology here kind of also in the cybernetic sense, I guess, in the kind of Lumanian sense of system and then an environment that is on the outside and that is kind of inaccessible to the system. Incommunicable. In the context of Taylorist management, it's clear that this is not an idealist proposition, but rather a statement that reflects a materialist logic taken straight from the shop floor. As Castoriadis specifies, quote, a factory in which the workers were really and totally mere cogs in the machine, blindly executing the orders of management, that was come to a stop in a quarter of an hour. Rather than describing some hypothetical situation, Castoriadis details what is alternatively known as a white strike, or a work to rule strike, or a kakani, in which workers follow the rules and regulations to the letter, such that they end up undermining their spirits. For instance, Parisian cab drivers sometimes protest the municipality by meticulously following the regulations of the Code Routier, thus grinding traffic to a screeching halt. Similarly, during the Russian February Revolution of 1917, the Cossacks devoutly obeyed the order not to move their position, thus allowing protesters to crawl under their horses and storm St. Petersburg's exposed center. These examples illustrate how rationalized systems secretly rely on unarticulated outsides, like tacit knowledge, improvisation, or even unregistered overtime. And these outsides is what they actually try to officially suppress and drive out. So the white strike demonstrates the extent to which rationalized systems depend on activity that is strictly off the books. The white strike brings the central paradox of rationalization to light because it also follows its own paradoxical logic. In an important sense, the white strike is not a strike at all, because those apparently on strike are, in fact, still carrying out their jobs. Indeed, the point is that they carry them out perfectly. And rather than a strategy of refusal, then, the white strike refers to a situation of total obedience. It carries the process of rationalization to the nightmarish endpoints of its own dreams of universality. Total obedience, it turns out, forms the logical endpoint at which obedience veers back into sabotage. As Timothy Morton succinctly states, it shows that, quote, to kill or destroy is to reduce something to consistency. The white strike is therefore imminent critique in action, a ruthless politics of consistency. It is disobedience because it is obedience. It transcends by totalizing. What the white strike demonstrates is that a system of rules only ever functions against an outside of unruliness or even rule breaking, even if the system officially strives to eliminate this outside. The white strike must thus be understood as a general refusal of the system's outside. It is an ecological strike that lays bare the inconsistency of the system's desire for consistency. Castoriadis' critique of ideology reveals the paradox that rules always require unruliness. A hidden humanization vitalizes Taylorist dehumanization. He's backed up by James C. Scott, who argues that Taylorism's totalizing impulse eventually secured its demise. The utopian dream of Taylorism, he writes, was ultimately unrealizable. Like all what he calls high modernist schemes of social engineering that Scott details in Seeing Like a State, from top-down city planning to scientific forestry, Taylorism's weak spot was its fatal neglect of its environment. In the analogous case of monocropping of scientific forestry, this environmental neglect was most literal, as the practice slowly destroyed the wider ecosystem on which the planted crops turned out to depend for their very life. Translated to Taylorism, its ecosystem is teeming with unofficial knowledges, implicit practices, and the improvisations of workers, all of which were regarded as inefficiencies that needed to be weeded out, as it were. It made these high modernist schemes inherently unsustainable. Echoing Castoriadis, Scott summarizes how, quote, formal order is always, and to some considerable degree, parasitic on informal processes, which the formal scheme does not recognize, without which it could not exist, and which it alone it cannot create or maintain. In contradistinction to the official rationalized knowledge of social engineering, Scott identifies the existence of Matisse. Matisse, it's like a Greek word of sorts, or the wide variety of implicit knowledges, informal processes, and unregistered motions that rationalization ceaselessly strives to design out, yet on which the system nevertheless thrives. It forms the unwritten half of rationalization, on which the written half hinges. A fatal element of thermodynamic rationalization was the instability generated by its logic of totalization, its blindness to paradox and ecology that made it vulnerable to ecological strike. And indeed, strikes there were, although not necessarily limited to the wide variety. Fordism, of which we might consider Taylorism to be a part, came under pressure from various angles, with the social critique of Taylorism peaking in the student and worker revolts of 1968. Writers from the Trontian post-workerist tradition, the Italian Marxists say, have stressed the political role of labor in the transformations of capitalism as a correction to histories that focus on the autonomous laws of capital and the development of the forces of production. While the question of what exactly led to the demise of Fordism remains open and contested, it is generally thought to have been spurred on by a mix of deepening labor protest, stagflation crisis of the 70s, the internationalization of production, and counter-inflationary strategies that interrupted the Fordist social contract. Now, while I do not wish to resolve this debate here, I just do want to highlight how a societal critique of the ecological neglect of thermodynamic rationalization contributed to the breakdown of Fordism and Taylorism, and therefore also of thermodynamic rationalization as such. This point is best made by Luc Boltanski and F. Capello in The New Spirit of Capitalism, in which they chronicle the decisive role of the worker revolts of 1968 in the transition to the post-Fordist era. Building on Weber's original Spirit of Capitalism, Boltanski and Capello used the notion to refer to the ideological justification of capitalism through an appeal to the common good that provides ethical motivation for its agents. The spirit of capitalism evolves along with the development of capitalism itself. It transformed from the late 19th century Weberian spirit of the bourgeois entrepreneur into the second spirit, which dominated the 1930s through to the 1960s, and which centers on the bureaucratic manager of the large-scale industrial firms of Fordism. This second spirit, which we might call the spirit of thermodynamic rationalization, became the target of a dual critique in the worker and student revolts of 68, which Boltanski and Capello distinguish as social critique and artistic critique, respectively. Now, these critiques are rooted in two different sources of indignation, as they say, sources of indignation. On the one hand, the injustices of exploitation and inequality for social critique, and on the other hand, the injustices of alienation and inauthenticity for artistic critique. Whereas social critique has always been dominant in the history of class struggle, in the May movement, artistic critique joined the rejection of the Taylorist organization of work with its command and control hierarchies and universalized drudgery. Protesters instead demanded autonomy and self-management, or nothing short of the quote-unquote unbounded liberation of human creativity. It led ultimately from the 1970s onward to the rise of what they call the third spirit of capitalism. One of Boltanski and Capello's central accomplishments is their formulation of a sophisticated theory of social change that assigns societal critique the role of material and normative motor of capitalist development. Yet critique is a complex phenomenon, suggests Boltanski and Capello, neither the pure expression of power struggle, nor exclusively an exercise in rational deliberation. Instead, critique represents an antagonistic material force that is nevertheless situated within a space of justification. Despite this sophistication, however, critique cannot explain history without taking in the response of capital. The true cunning of capital in the aftermath of May 1968, Boltanski and Capello argue, was that capital played off artistic critique against social critique. So capital sacrificed the social demand for security, while artistic autonomy became the watchword of the new spirit of capitalism and new forms of capitalist exploitation. Whether as a form of mere recuperation or more of a perversion and corruption, the bohemian values of artistic critique now found a new home at the heart of post-Fordist exploitation. To trace this change in the spirit of capitalism, Boltanski and Capello's method is to interrogate the dominant discourse in management literature, since this literature is directed at the agents on which the reproduction of this spirit depends. And in that case, this is the cadres or the managers of this third spirit of capitalism. So in literature from the 1960s, Boltanski and Ciappello find a sustained critique of hierarchically organized bureaucracies and an anti-authoritarian ethos. And from the 1990s onward, this ethical prescriptive is extended to all wage earners. So not just the managers, but to all wage earners. Boltanski and Ciappello also discover a newfound fascination with competition and flexibility. But above all, the third spirit of capitalism that they identify in these management books emphasizes the values thematized in the artistic critique of the May movement. So those of autonomy, spontaneity, creativity, conviviality, and so on. This new spirit, Boltanski and Ciappello add, mobilizes a wholly new space, or what they call a city of discursive justification. The network becomes the central image of what they call the projective city, in which projects are the temporary formations in the ever-changing spider webs of the social. The great person, or the successful agent, say, in this city is flexible, agile, and eager to learn, rather than displaying the old virtues of efficiency that was central to the industrial city. Such agents must live by a generalized ethos of what they call connectionism, the extension of the network to the benefit of all. Not only spiritually, but also materially, Boltanski and Ciappello argue, the artistic critique of the May movement came to be recuperated and exploited by capitalism. In contrast to the rigid hierarchies of Taylorism, flexibility became the dominant new maxim. In what they call external flexibility, organizations became increasingly lean in order to successfully surf the waves of market signals in a sea of radical uncertainty. Through processes such as subcontracting and outsourcing, there emerged a modular production network of organizations controlled by decentralized market forces rather than by hierarchic command. Internally, or within firms, a similar transformation occurred. While employment conditions were casualized and flexibilized, the work process itself also changed, now resembling a distributive network of post-industrial laborers engaged in multitasking, continuous learning, and communicating. Taylorism thus made way for Toyotism, or Kaizen, which placed a premium on self-control, self-monitoring, and self-improvement. Summarized then, Boltanski and Ciappello convincingly show how the artistic critique of capitalism was separated from social critique and enlisted by capital, both in spirit and as a material force, in order to ensure its continued accumulation. Boltanski and Ciappello therefore present a history of societal critique of what we might call thermodynamic rationalization. Their critique centers on the ecological neglect of this mode of rationalization, the neglect of all these improvisations of workers and so on, surfacing in the call for the liberation of the artistic outside suppressed by Taylorism. When we recall Castoriadis's and Scott's considerations on the necessity of this outside for the system's functioning, it becomes clear that the co-opting of artistic critique by capital was always already a logical possibility. Both in spirit and in the flesh, the capitalist work process underwent a radical transformation from the 70s onwards. Now, as the next section will show, and this kind of ends the first section, there's two sections in the talk. As the next section will show, capital attempted to take the weakness of thermodynamic rationalization and turn it into its strength. Ecological neglect needed to become ecological valorization. This radical transformation is not just political economic, but also pertains to a wider reorganization of knowledge and power. It's a mode of rationalization, what I would call that. Capitalism transitions from a logic of industrial efficiency to networked connectionism, from the thermodynamic rationalization of Fordism to the cybernetic rationalization of post-Fordism. So just to briefly summarize here, so we got these rationalized systems that tend to sort of close off from their environments, but then actually start undermining themselves because they actually rely on this openness toward the outside. And basically what artistic critique is doing is saying, well, look, you can't neglect this outside because it kind of sucks to be on the outside. So not of course from the perspective of the system necessarily, but that ultimately was enlisted by the system itself. Now for the second part. Post-Fordism goes by many names. In management schools, it was long known as the new economy, while other sociological labels often emphasize its knowledge-based character. Such labels range from information society, post-modernity, post-industrial society, cognitive capitalism, and empire, to the now popular neoliberal capitalism. While Fordism was animated by a fascination for heat and fire, post-Fordism takes inspiration from the mechanical computation of numbers. The work process came to rely increasingly on cybernetic technoscience, a new mode of knowing centered around the logic of feedback and control. Information and communication technologies flooded the workplace, from reprogrammable robots via gamified interfaces to artificial intelligence. Not only did cybernetic technologies enter farms, factories, and offices, companies themselves were also imagined to be giant information processors. From the 1950s and 60s onward, management theories increasingly borrowed themes and concepts from new sciences, such as complexity theory and systems theory. Organizations were redefined as cybernetic systems in which workers and machines were included as equals within a powerful self-organizing feedback loop aimed at adaptation to a turbulent business environment. Boltanski and Capello themselves actually draw upon three main non-management sources of inspiration for what they call the Connectionist Imagination of the third spirit. So this one is communication, two, complexity, and three, disorder, chaos, and self-organization. Likewise, Nigel Thrift mobilizes an impressive body of literature to show how managing complexity and information has become paramount to management in soft capitalism. That's what he calls it, soft capitalism. If Fordism was all about energy, post-Fordism is about information. Labor organization followed cybernetic technologies into this new regime of communication. The rise of post-Fordist production saw the relative expansion of the tertiary sector in the capitalist core, and now also in the periphery. A sector that produces mainly immaterial commodities through cognitive, creative, communicative, or effective labor. Such communicative labor is what Hart and Negri, following Lazzarato, call immaterial labor, or what Robin Murray splits into the categories of cultural producers, like marketeers, designers, content managers, and systems managers, like financiers, lawyers, and accountants. In this tertiary sector, the Taylorist style of management quickly runs up against its own limits, since surface work relies heavily on the ecological potential of what Scott called Matisse, uncodifiable skills and practices. The work process hinges on the creative potential of autonomous workers, a potential that is nullified once codified into strict rules. As Hegel already recognized, one cannot force autonomy. Surface work has to come from below rather than from above. And this poses a critical question for capital concerning the work process. How to govern what cannot really be governed, how to control the uncontrollable, or more comprehensively, with respect to the theme that we're talking about here, how can the ecological potential that was at stake in artistic critique be put to work? One might recognize in such questions the guiding problem of Michel Foucault's work, for whom power always operates through freedom. Foucault's central question, as Greg Lambert has noted, was always the following, quote, if power originates in a manner that is in some ways irreducible to rationalization, then how does one go about the business of rationalizing it? The pertinence of this question is heightened in this cybernetic age, since cybernetics, with what Andrew Pickering calls its ontology of unknowability, fundamentally concerns how control systems might navigate the uncontrollable. How, this science asks, do systems of communication pilot the incommunicable? Perhaps it is no coincidence that Foucault chose the term governmentality for this art or techne of navigation, governor being cognate with the Greek Kubernetes, steersman, after which Norbert Wiener named cybernetics. Beyond superficial similarities, Foucault's notion has much in common with cybernetics' objective of governing the paradoxes that follow from its self-referential feedback loops. Liberal governmentality, like the disciplinary dispositives with which it's bound up, operates through a paradoxical principle of self-limitation. It produces the freedom liberal governmentality produces the freedom that simultaneously threatens it. While, according to Foucault, this has been the central challenge of government since the 17th or 18th century, it demands new answers in the post-Fordist workplace. It is no longer enough to separate power and freedom into distinct regions. Like in Taylorism, you would have basically the freedom for the designers of the work process, and of course the power would just be directed at the people executing the tasks. But now power must also enter into the realm of freedom and vice versa. Now, therefore, the question of government becomes explicitly cybernetic. How does one rationalize that which cannot be rationalized? To answer the question, one must start by acknowledging a change that occurred in the means of production. As Robin Murray observes, quote, the means of production have been internalized within labor and cannot be entirely appropriated from labor. This is, first, a reformulation of the point that the worker's autonomy now forms part of the production process and can therefore no longer be excluded from it as it was under Taylorism. And second, it suggests a collapse of the distinction between capital and labor. This suggestion comes from the human capital theory, which was first put forward by economists Theodore Schultz and Gary Becker in the 1970s. Human capital, Gary Becker writes, is important because productivity in modern economies is based on the creation, dissemination, and utilization of knowledge. The worker's knowledge, passions, skills, basically their whole personality, should be seen as a human resource, a form of capital that requires investment and should yield a return in the form of a wage. As Foucault succinctly states, human capital theory turns the worker into a sort of enterprise for himself, an entrepreneur of himself, a new type of homo economicus who is, quote unquote, eminently governable. Since Becker's theory operates on a set of measurable assumptions, the behavior of the homo economicus can be calculated, measured, communicated, and therefore controlled. The nature of this control, however, is radically different from thermodynamic control. To demonstrate the difference, sociologist Ulrich Brückling contrasts human capital theory with its unofficial forerunner, which he finds in Rudolf Goldscheid's rational administration of organic capital, or Menschenökonomie. Whereas Goldscheid's form of administration aims to intervene directly in the choices of agents through rational administration, human capital theory merely attempts to govern their behavior by controlling incentives and promoting competition. Human capital theory does not directly steer the action of agents, but instead manipulates, as it later came to be known in the psychology of nudging, the agent's choice architecture, so as to stimulate them into making better decisions. In other words, human capital theory no longer totalizes a sphere of perfect communicability, but instead institutes a framework of communicability in order to unleash the productivity of an incommunicable resource, namely human personality. This, in essence, is how this new entrepreneurial subject is governed. The paradox of freedom and power is not suppressed by capital, but rather exploited. This is no coincidence, speculate Boltanski and Capello when discussing what they call the liberated firm of self-organized teams working in a network. Controlling the uncontrollable is not something with an infinite number of solutions. In fact, the only solution is for people to control themselves. Control must therefore be devolved to the freely operating agents on the ground. Post-Taylorist management thus relinquishes the dream of total control and instead limits itself to controlling the context of autonomous action. It designs and constructs this context through newly invented metrological techniques such as brainstorming, mind mapping, and clustering, as well as human resource methods such as total quality management and 360-degree feedback. These technologies stimulate the creativity of the worker, kindling the productive power of their whole personality. Creativity, as Ulrich Brückling summarizes the operation, is not produced, it is enabled. Post-Taylorist management thus departs significantly from the common sense of the thermodynamic age. In fact, it looks like no less than a complete reversal of Taylorism. The total, this is a quote by André Gortz, the total and entirely repressive domination of the worker's personality was to be replaced by the total mobilization of that personality. Whereas under Fordism, workers were ordered to treat the workplace merely as a site for the deployment of their raw labor power, they are now invited to treat it as a space of artistic investment. The worker's soul, as Mauricio Lazzarato writes, needs to become part of the factory. Firms therefore needed also a type of employee that could take up the invitation. Economic production required a preceding production of subjectivity. In order to capture this production of subjectivity, which is capital shaping of creative, autonomous, cooperative, and entrepreneurial personalities, post-workerist writers like Michael Hart and Antonio Negri and Mauricio Lazzarato take up Foucault's concept of biopower. Whereas Foucault originally coined it to describe the entry of life into history more generally, the post-operaist philosophers instead primarily use it to frame the production of living labor and subjectivity under post-Fordism. The Italian Marxists nevertheless aim to retain the paradoxical structure of Foucault's original concept. For Foucault, biopower refers to a mode of government. It is part of a wider constellation of techniques and dispositives gathered under the rubric of liberal governmentality, a paradoxical mode of power that, as mentioned, operates through freedom. Biopower is exercised not through sheer domination, but by appealing to an individual's capacity for autonomous action and thought. In the case of post-Fordist biopower, this means that capital stimulates the creative and autonomous abilities of workers for the purpose of surplus value production. However shrewd and refined this method of control may seem, its paradoxical logic puts capital in a vulnerable position. Capital can only shape the personalities of living labor by inducing a personal autonomy that contradicts, resists, and potentially refuses such shaping. The capitalist wants cooperation without solidarity, disruption without revolution, effective investment without material ownership. This is why the post-workerists make a distinction that is absent from, or rather implicit in, Foucault's writings, namely between biopower and biopolitics. Whereas biopower designates the collection of governmental techniques and strategies employed by capital and even sovereignty, biopolitics denotes the resulting ethico-political space in which labor moves. This ethico-political space, let's say the autonomy and personality of workers, is both a potential site of resistance and the force that sustains biopower. This is where Foucault's governmental paradox of power through freedom comes fully to the fore. Biopower only works through biopolitics. Post-Fordist labor, in other words, operates in a paradoxical situation of what André Gortz calls autonomy within heteronomy. Autonomy is simulated within the strict confines of the logic of surplus value production. Stressing the same point, Lazzarato writes that the demands for authenticity, far from eliminating, this is a quote, far from eliminating the antagonism between hierarchy and cooperation, between autonomy and command, actually reposes this antagonism at a higher level. One has to express oneself. One has to speak, communicate, cooperate, and so forth. Thus, the first level of the work process, how to speak and so on, is left to the biopolitical self-organization of workers. However, this first order of biopolitical self-control is incited and provoked by the capitalist biopower on a second level, so that they must speak, that they must cooperate, etc. Crucially then, post-Taylorist control is directed at the level of the second order rather than the first. Biopower is a form of second order control, the control of control. Foucault calls this the conduct of conduct, or an action upon an action. It structures the possible field of action rather than steering such action directly. In Niklas Luhmann's terms, Luhmann is actually kind of in the background or always present in this talk without really being named, but here he is. Luhmann's terms, the second order nature of biopower means that the distinction between biopower and biopolitics is re-entered into the biopower side of the distinction. So as control now becomes a second order process, it also becomes fundamentally self-referential because control controls control. Now, since control becomes self-referential, it inevitably runs into paradoxes, of which the liar's paradox serves as a paradigmatic example. So the liar's paradox being, for instance, this sentence is a lie, because if it is a lie, then it's not a lie, and if it's not a lie, then it is a lie. So you can never determine which one it is. The art of governmentality as the conduct of conduct then essentially refers to the navigation of these paradoxes, most notably the dual paradox of freedom through power and power through freedom. However complex this post-Taylorist logic may be, it finally crystallizes in a strikingly simple formula, namely be creative or be spontaneous. This is the solitary rule that replaces the entire system of minutiae that constituted Taylorist scientific management. The dynamism of this chant, be spontaneous, derives from its paradoxical appeal. One follows the rule by breaking it, and one breaks the rule by following it. If the worker is acting spontaneously, then they are merely following the rule. But if the worker chooses to obey the rule, that means that they would be ignoring the rule. Be spontaneous is thus a rule that calls for its own transgression. It is what John Mackenzie has called a liminal norm, quote unquote, the valorization of liminal transgression or resistance itself becomes normative. The rule therefore liberates its outside. It invites all that is not included in the rule itself. In this sense, the adage forms the mirror image of thermodynamic rationalization. Instead of suppressing the system's paradoxical, the metrological system's paradoxical openness to their environments, so instead of suppressing that, this uniquely simple piece of metrology mobilizes and exploits its own ecology. Worker improvisation, creativity, and personality, along with all the further potentialities that the system could never predict, can be made productive by introducing a jolt of controlled rebellion. This strategy marks the transition from thermodynamic to cybernetic rationalization. Managers began to reimagine organizations as cybernetic machines rather than steam engines. Workers were therefore no longer thought to produce equivalence in terms of energy units, but rather create differences or information. The total measurability of labor power gave way to what Boutang calls the immeasurability of invention power. Whereas under Taylorism, the worker's spontaneity and personality were viewed as potential sources of energy leakage, post-Taylorist management understands these very same factors as immeasurable and uncontrollable sources of information. It therefore shifts attention from the system's struggle against entropy to the stimulation and capture of negative entropy in the system's environment. This negative entropy or ecological complexity is now viewed as what Boutang calls the positive externalities on which cognitive capitalism runs. Political economy, he underscores, Boutang, has no choice but to deal with this relation it has to its own outside. Whereas under Taylorism, ecological complexity was first and foremost deemed a threat to the system's communicability and efficiency, post-Taylorism seeks to harness the productive potential of this ecological incommunicability. It valorizes invention power as a form of ecological production. So I'm nearing the end now. It's basically a conclusion. The transition from the white strike that we talked about, right, the perfect obedience, to the equally paradoxical imperative to be spontaneous signals the transformation of the mode of rationalization, so the transformation in the mode of rationalization that occurred in the 1970s, the shift from the thermodynamic to the cybernetic mode. Capital's response to the artistic critique of the 1960s and 70s was to incorporate its core values of authenticity, autonomy, and creativity into the work process. Capital stopped viewing this unwritten half of rationalization as something that was yet to be rationalized by its written half, and instead started appreciating how the unwritten half, in fact, constituted the most important half. This is kind of a reference to Wittgenstein on the Tractatus, because he wrote in a letter that the Tractatus consisted of two parts, namely the one that was written and the one that wasn't written, and the one that wasn't written was the most important. So it's kind of a reference to that. Anyway, continuing. In recognizing this ecology of rationalization, the outside of this rationalized system, capital sought to overcome its ecological neglect and thus its vulnerability to ecological strike. Instead, the outside needed to be put to work. Hence the post-Fordist slogan, be spontaneous, an adage that seeks to liberate the system's uncontrollable outside, a rule that demands to be broken. Thus, concluding then, while the white strike showed Fordism that perfect obedience inevitably becomes disobedience, post-Fordism responded by turning disobedience into perfect obedience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, for a fantastic cartography. We have 45 minutes for questions. All kinds of questions, I think, are welcome at this point. So questions of clarification, as well as hey, oh yeah, there you are. So my screen started to move. All kinds of questions. I don't really want to first do a round of questions of clarification and then move into some different questions. Is there somebody that I can give the floor immediately? Yes, please, Davor.
Okay. Hello. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the talk. As Iris on the two just said, it was a nice cartography, right, of all these post-structural concepts that can be used and applied to the developments of the, let's say, capital-induced relationship between humans and the world. Anyway, I have a lot of questions, but I want to ask something about clarification. And this is in the beginning you talked about technical rationality, right? And in German, I think usually we say instrumental rationality. You know, from Horkheimer, the critique of instrumental rationality. Do you make a distinction? Was it just a translation mistake, or is it maybe in Netherlands differently translated or something? Because I would have said that maybe instrumental rationality would be something different than technical rationality, right? So you can be technically rational, but don't have to be instrumental rational in the sense of being utilitarian or something like this. You know, you see my point. So I just wanted to ask, was that just a glitch or on purpose?
Yeah, that was actually on purpose. It was meant as a kind of simplification, because you're right that Max Weber uses the word Zweckrationalität. So
okay, yeah, that's again something different. Yes.
Yeah, and that's purposive rationality. Which also the Frankfurt School uses that, but they also sometimes use instrumentale Rationalität. But yeah, Zweckrationalität was originally translated by, I think, Parsons as instrumental reason, which of course has this the instrument implied in it. But even with Weber itself and with the Frankfurt School, they made a quite clear link to technical reason and to technology, which they saw simply as one of the main examples of Zweckrationalität. So I didn't want to get, but yeah, so I made it like a super simple, short introduction to rationalization. So that's why, I call it technical rationality. Does that clarify? Does that answer your question?
Unfortunately, my internet broke off, so I didn't hear the middle part. It's yeah, okay, whatever. It's I'll watch the video later. I was just thinking maybe the distinction is important, you know, because you can have a technical rationality which is induced by the means of production, and that forces people to do something, right? But you can have an instrumental reason which is societal, and thereby a question of convention and a question of discourse. You see my point? So you have, so to speak, an objective type of instrument of rationality, which would be technical. For example, Fordism could also be understood as simply a technical necessity, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily a capitalistic logic behind it. So to speak. You see my point? So this could be a technical rationality which is imposed on the people, on the production, by the means of production, which is independent of, you know, the societal power structure. So that's why I said maybe it would make sense to distinguish that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean that's incredibly important, I think, because I think for Weber and the Frankfurt School, the different members, they have different views of technology, but I think in many cases they share. Let's say, especially for Weber and Habermas, maybe technology does have a kind of essence. So technology is a kind of means-oriented. This is basically purposive reasoning. So it is just, reasoning in terms of what are the most efficient means to attain a preset goal. And so if you really take that logic seriously, then you would end up with this kind of thinking of, well, look, technology develops in modernity, and therefore there's only one possible social formation that sort of needs to follow that rationality, whatever that may be. And so one of the reasons I try to sort of historicize this technical rationality is precisely by taking seriously the paradoxical co-imbrication of technology and social life more broadly. So that's also why I'm talking about the mode of rationalization, for instance, and cybernetic rationalization is one of the forms in which that appears.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, or
maybe I can follow up, not necessarily on about this very precise and technical discussion, but I mean, when I opened the discussion, Jan, I used the word cartography on purpose. So you gave us an incredibly important, precise, dense cartography. But at the same time, of course, cartographizing or navigating played a role in your talk. So I would like to ask you to kind of reflect maybe a little bit on your own position as a navigator, as a cartographer of rationalization, of the topic of your PhD. So where does, for example, standpoint epistemology play a role in your work?
okay. If I interpret your question as, because I'm not entirely sure, honestly, what you mean by cartography, but
very simple. You produced a map.
Yeah.
But at the same time, navigation played a role in your conceptualizations of rationalization.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I might know what you mean. So in the dissertation, I rely heavily on Niklas Luhmann, and as I said, he's also very much in the background here, thinking about how the closure of systems produces actually paradoxically their openness to the world, and trying to sort of synthesize critical theory and Niklas Luhmann's systems theory is quite difficult, and it has been tried before and maybe not always very successfully, because critical theory always tends to think thinks that you are indeed part of that map, right? You have to reflect on your own presuppositions, your own social, cultural, but also related to gender and race and so on and so forth. You have to relate to that position in social life, and that has an effect on both the knowledge that you can have and also the effects that knowledge could have on society, and it should have a certain effect. And that's that value question of what to do, or what political purpose theory should have, that is part of any good sociology. Whereas Niklas Luhmann is much more of a sort of, it's difficult to categorize him, but maybe somewhat of a sort of neo-positivist, in the sense that he would say, well, look, there's multiple systems, social systems in society, two of which are politics and science. And science is a kind of self-referential circle of methods and theories and objects and instruments and so on. And then you have politics, and that does, motions and amendments and political parties and parliaments and so on. And these can't really, these have their own inner logic, and therefore you can't just do political things from the scientific system. That's just a logical impossibility, or social logical impossibility. And so therefore, to ask the kind of question that critical theory does, namely what should theory accomplish in the social world, to Luhmann is just an illegitimate question, is a transgression of what sociology could do. So I try to kind of solve that by sort of emphasizing that already in Luhmann, of course, there is already this kind of acknowledgement of how observations are contingent, and how they are also situated within these changing environments, and that this contingency necessitates a kind of choice. And I think that part of this choice has to be political, and it cannot be precisely because of its ecological situation, needs to be partly political and cannot be reduced to science. That's really an arbitrary, an arbitrary limitation. It's quite difficult to get into that here, but so yeah, I think you would have to reflect always on the position that you take within that map as a critical theorist anyway, and that you have to take seriously the systemic perspective, as it were, and the ecologies within which that moves.
Katarina, please.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I'm just lost the screen. Boomer's confusion with technology. Anyway, thank you, Jana. I really enjoyed your talk. Iris, stop laughing. I really enjoyed your talk. It was very concise. It was fascinating, actually, and I think I could kind of sense where you're navigating us on this map, as Iris put it. So let me check if my guess was correct. Are you saying that rationality, reason, rationalism, etc., of our era is somehow grounded in the process of rationalization that is deduced or derived from the mode of production? In a way, are you saying that are you making kind of a Marxian point where you have the base, the mode of production, which kind of necessitates this principle of rationalization, understood in the sense in which you employ the term, which then serves the base for rationality, reason, rationalism in science, in the superstructure as we know it nowadays, as it is characteristic of modernity, let's put it that way, or of modern reason. Would you say the one, I don't know if the question is clear, I'm improvising with the thesis as I'm posing the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I don't know that I can answer it fully, honestly, because it's what I'm trying to do is to do social philosophy, and I guess it's a kind of a speculative approach. So I'm sure a historian could make, could also have some things to say about maybe thermodynamic rationalization, or whether that's actually such a unitary or consistent picture, or cybernetic rationalization. Maybe that exaggerates or stylizes a lot. And I don't mind that necessarily, because I'm trying to sort of, through that approach, try to stylize that logic to get it into view. So the question of where this change came from, whether it was from science, from technology, or whether it was from changes in capitalism, for instance. I don't know, this the lack of growth in the 70s or something, whether it's really that's just like base determined. I just rather wish not to say in a way, but what I want to say two things. I guess I would want to balance still. I would definitely not want to be reductionist about it, let's say economistic. And this is actually one of the reasons why, again, I'm trying to historicize these kind of technological materialist logics by relating them to changes in knowledge and technology. So that's already kind of it meant as a pushback against that. Equally, I also do, I kind of want to recognize that that the capitalist economy does have some sort of what Bob Jessup actually calls ecological dominance. So you could say in the ecosystem of modern society, among all these kind of systems, it has a kind of not really dominating, but it has a dominance with respect to these. So there, I think it's a matter of, if you would really historically want to get at these things, you would have to trace these kind of paradoxical, nonlinear, complex patterns among the capitalist economy and the many systems that exist within society broadly. Does that, I hope that...
Yeah, I understand, and it was very clear that this was not your, point of departure or your episteme, and you wouldn't operate with the notions of base and superstructure. I just used them, as a sort of an analogy to illustrate the point. The question is basically if the two things are these two phenomena, so rationalization in production and rationality as we understand it in modernity, be it in science or philosophy, do they have some sort of a similar structure, organizing principle? Would you, a homology of a kind,
Yeah, I think so.
You think so?
That is definitely the point of cybernetic rationalization. That there is that these changes in the economy aren't just economic changes, but are actually reflect and have been mutually influenced by changes in science and technology.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot.
I don't remember who was first, Garrett or Adam. Was it Garrett? Adam.
Go ahead, Adam.
Okay, Adam, please go ahead.
Thanks. Jan, thanks for that awesome talk. And it definitely clarified a lot of things for me. One thing I'm wondering though, and I want to try something out on you, is it seems to me what I'm hearing is something like, and please tell me if I'm wrong, a kind of becoming ecological of a kind of economic epistemology. And I'm thinking of the way in which somebody like Hayek in his writings on economic epistemology was already thinking about the sort of deep decentralization of economic epistemology and how it functioned as a kind of critique of the sort of centralized, rationalized understanding of economic knowledge that could be calculated. And it was already thinking about and moving towards a more spontaneous, autonomous way of thinking about everyone's in possession of economic knowledge, and it's sort of dispersed and distributed. And it seems to me that this was already this moment in like 1948 when he was writing, I'm trying to think what essays they were, anyway, I can't even remember, but there was already this kind of becoming ecological of economic epistemology. And I'm wondering if this is kind of one way that you could frame your own work, is in terms of this shift, this epistemological transformation within economics, and that's played out in managerial theory later on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting that you say that, because actually at one point, which I cut out for this talk, but I do say actually literally that that cybernetic rationalization is the becoming ecological of thermodynamic rationalization, because there is a kind of continuity, but there's also like the paradoxes stay sort of the same, but the way they are navigated are different. They are exploited rather than suppressed, basically. And
okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that seems spot on to me. And with respect to Hayek, so that's one of those really fascinating homologies or analogies, or I don't know. So for Hayek, of course, he was in part of this socialist calculation debate, which was really about the possibility of economic planning. And then, of course, the strongest argument you can make is that it's just impossible to plan, because there's no way to have all the knowledge that's distributed throughout the economy in all these market parties. And that's definitely what he argued. So you could, at that point, so definitely he kind of already has this sort of logic that you could see as similar to cybernetic. And in one of his famous essays written in 1945 or so, I think, he actually calls the market an information processor. But this is a little bit weird, because it seems at that point that this is a coincidence of sorts. I don't know, like Foucault talks about the the subconscious or something, the the historical priori, right? This is a certain historical subconscious or something that might be kind of this mystical force, maybe, that could explain it. But after that, anyway, Hayek starts to get into contact with cyberneticians. Can't think of the top of my head which ones they are, but he starts to come into contact with cyberneticians, and then afterwards starts writing specifically in cybernetic terms. So the market is, for him, starts to become a kind of complex communication or information system that, precisely because it, as you said, is distributed and is it's in principle impossible to plan and know and measure and so on, control, really. And so therefore we have no, there's, the only way is to submit to this sort of this contingent force of the market. So that's one thing. But then what makes it even more interesting, I think, is that what characterizes neoliberalism, and this is kind of the other pillar, I guess, of this point about the development of capitalism, is not that they're not saying you should just like let things go, let the market handle it, and we can't do anything. The point for Hayek is to make what he calls an economic constitution. So you have, just like you have political rights enshrined in law, you need to enshrine economic rights, and this constitution of simple rules, legal rules. This then spawns sort of magically, almost, this market that you cannot control, that's unpredictable, but you can predict and sort of or control and measure and so on. The constitution, the rules that govern that, or that produce that market. So again, I see that analogy between that what I started with Thomas Ray, with the simulation of artificial life, right? You institute simple rules, and then this evolution starts of complex behavior that cannot be planned. And this kind of paradoxical relation, I think, is really interesting. And I think also no complete coincidence that for Hayek that was cybernetically inspired.
Let's move to Garrett.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jan. This was a super fascinating talk, and I have a bunch of notes. I'm also coming from arts and media, and so to some degree, I'm also interested in, while I recognize the critiques of becoming ecological, maybe there's something to hold on to here. I was really struck by this artistic critique and thinking about of that era as something which sort of played with the outsides of rationalization. It got me thinking about, well, not just game theory, but game studies and sort of the proceduralist movement in new media, where people are thinking about, especially in games, people like Ian Bogo's thinking about play being something that is structured by rules. And there are critiques of this as well. So my question is is to ask you to speculate maybe on the future of play, or whether there's a possible liberatory potential still for play. And I'm also thinking of this because the way you sort of elucidated the Fordist and post-Fordist conceptions of economy as machines. It's also thinking about like Marx's fragment on machines, right? Where he's talking about workers being these kinds of black boxes that interpolate between static determined machinery, right? And so they become these conscious interlinkages between machines. This is where then surplus value is extracted. In fact, I'm also reminded that Wiener makes sort of a similar point in his later book, Human Use of Human Beings. He also has kind of a caveat there about these potentials of cybernetics. But I'm interested in play because it seems like the white strike is like a subtraction of play from the machine, right? If a machine actually needs play, like it needs some space between the gears, so to speak, in order for it to actually operate, the white strike is to sort of degrease or delubricate the machine, which is like very different than the also the mid 60s, like Mario, what is this? You have to throw your bodies on the machine, the gears of the machine speech. So I'll end there. The question again is just to speculate on the liberatory potential of play. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, it's quite difficult, honestly, because the problem, of course, yeah, I guess this is a problem that of course it isn't this perfect. So I tried to sort of stylize this logic in which all play, becomes recuperated and becomes simply somehow internalized. The complexity gets reduced and it becomes part of the machine, which now is only running way faster than it was. And of course, it doesn't happen always like that. And so there's, I think in that sense, that kind of paradox that the Italian Marxists are getting at, where this play is both fueling surplus value extraction, but also still remains a site of resistance, I think is just the way to go about it, honestly, because which isn't to say it's easy or something, but it invites us maybe to think about the complexities that structure work and capitalism today. So there's no kind of romantic solution, definitely not anymore, to say, well, look, we just need to oppose this machine by play, because that's already become part of a wider logic of value extraction. And what I do think is still relevant with the white strike, and that still serves as an inspiration maybe, is just this idea of transcending by totalizing, which I think for the Frankfurt School was already the point of immanent critique, that you totalize the system. So for instance, in some reading, I guess, of Marx, you could say, look, if you really take this seriously, this idea of the market as free and equal human beings that trade, and if you really take that seriously and you would actually somehow get to that point, that would no longer be capitalism. That would be, because capitalism actually then it derives its logic of accumulation from the defect of that logic, from inequality and from the extraction of surplus value. So I think that there's a kind of exciting, how should you put it? So you go along as a means of sabotage that could still work in some cases. So for instance, like CO2 tax or something, you could, if you would really internalize all the ecological costs into the system, that on the one hand, of course, you'd be commodifying everything. On the other hand, that's precisely what would be most destructive for the system, precisely because it relies on an outside secretly. So, maybe this is a kind of, it has maybe still both potentialities, so the potentiality of play, but also the potentiality maybe of obedience that represents strategies that might be available or unavailable, or might be more or less effective in social life. So, but I don't know. I don't have a recipe for how to solve everything, unfortunately. Does that help a bit, or what do you feel?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that thank you. There's a interesting paradox that emerges between this like obedience and resistance, which also has a kind of materialist. There's also kind of a material metaphor in some ways, resistance and amplification. You could think about it in terms of circuits as well, and become cybernetic, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I guess that a follow-up question for this discussion could be if you could elaborate a little bit on just this very short mentioning of John Mackenzie's work. I mean, I picked up his book Perform or Else, from my shelves and went through it, and he basically ends with a figuration, Jane Challenger, who and his final page. It's very interesting. I recommend this book to everyone. I don't know if you can see this, but she was gone. That's the end. And he starts to really elaborate with what he calls the lecture machine and trying to redo the university. So can you just explain a little bit more about John Mackenzie and how you see his work with figurations, or maybe his experimentations, especially with the university? How do you position them on your cartography?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's a complex one. First of all, because it's been a while, honestly, that I read that book. But yeah, the question, the concept of performance is, I think, very interesting for multiple reasons. For me, Lyotard, for instance, has also always been quite a big inspiration, and he, of course, talks about performativity, which I think you could see as his version of instrumental reason, really, and it's also literally efficiency for him. But then equally for Lyotard, he's always struggled to see performativity as related to what he calls paralogy. So it's never clear whether he means performativity as that which opposes paralogy or that which becomes stronger because of paralogy and through paralogy. So I guess, you know, the machine versus play, or these kind of dualisms that we've talked about. I think for what Mackenzie does really nicely, I think, is also show, for instance, the cybernetic influences of post-Fordism, and show how performativity then, you know, sort of maybe the Lyotard and the others that he talks about, that stresses the interrelation between these notions. But it seems that at the end of his book, if I have to, with the perfumation, I think is what he calls it. I mean, so yeah, maybe his strategy, it seems like, would be to produce a kind of weirdness that is so weird that the system could never recuperate. That's just beyond use or something. And maybe that could be an option. But I fear equally that might be, you know, that's like losing touch with everything, with, let's say, the urge to perform completely. Also seems to me that potentially risking, you know, being quite ineffective because it just does not engage anymore. So I'm just not entirely sure, because it's been a while and everything, but that's kind of my intuition, that might be a risk, but potentially also a potential, I guess, of his work.
Inviting more questions or comments. Davor, please.
Yeah, I would like to. Okay, just yeah, how should I? I'm on a complicated mission now. Do you speak German?
Not really, but I read it and I can understand it.
Oh, you can read, okay. Because there's actually a book that that analyzes all those homologies.
Okay.
You know, that we talked about earlier, that Katrina, and maybe I can share my screen. No, I can't. Or can I?
You need to be co-host.
Because I want to show you something quickly for the discussion.
Rista, can you give Davor the status of a co-host so he can share?
Yeah. Okay, Davor.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so can you see this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a PDF of my PhD thesis, like 800 pages, in which I have reconstructed all those, how should I say, historical genealogy of abstraction, right? And what you talked about earlier, the thermodynamical rationality, and then the cybernetic rationality, and so on, these are all forms of abstraction, right? Different types of how we abstract events in the world, so to speak. So what I wanted to show you here now, without being hopefully too annoying, this table of Catherine Hales, probably, I don't know, have you ever read the book How We Became Posthuman? Mm-hmm. Yeah. She speaks about these different waves of cybernetics, right? Mm-hmm. And so here you go. I don't know. Can you see? Can you read this, or is it too small?
I can read it. Okay,
so it's German. So what I want to show you here is this: we have different phases, or stages of cybernetics, or as I call it, informationalism, right? To deal with information. So we have the thermodynamics in the beginning, and then the concept of the system or of information becomes institutionalized or initialized with Uexküll, biology theory around 1920. Do you see my mouse actually?
Yeah.
Okay. So 1920, and then you have the first cybernetics. So the philosophies that appear at the same time. This is Wittgenstein, cultural philosophy, Heidegger, and so on. They all have some sort of proto-hybernetical moment not hybernetical, proto-cybernetical moment in them. So you have like homology here, and by the way, in German we call it form relationship. Yeah, it's there's a relationship of the forms, so homology or form relationship. And then in the first wave of real cybernetics, when the computers appear, you have the concept of homeostasis and autonomous steering and so on. And at the same time, you have in theory, for example, structuralism, hermeneutics, early body phenomenology and media theory and so on. And then in the next generation, you get cybernetics of second order, with autopoiesis the re-entry that you talked about earlier. And this is exactly where Luhmann appears, and where Foucault appears and so on. And then the third wave and the fourth, and now we enter the new type of, after the 20th century it was passive informationalism, where we only analyze systems. And in the 2000s, we switched to active informationalism, which is, we know how a system works, and now we can operate them, we can nudge them, we can push them, we can give them little incentives to move by themselves, right? So we needed the 20th century, we needed to understand what systems are, and now in the 21st, we can actively, so to speak, operate with them. And there again, you have waves, and the waves usually last like 20 years. That is not only for technical reasons, but also for the generation of the people who propagate this type of thinking. So for example, Latour was born 48, and all the people from his generation who say principally the same thing are all born 48, and then you have 20 years later a new generation that comes up with new ideas, so to speak. Yeah. And the point is, what I want to say is that, as you said earlier, the cybernetic rationality is not contradicting thermodynamical reasoning, but it's kind of building up on it.
Yeah,
it's accumulation, right? And so what you can see here is, so to speak, the table of the accumulation of abstraction in the 20th century, so to speak. So you have one phase building up on the achievements of the previous one, like step by step by step by step. And the last wave was 2000 to 2020, which is this new materialism, hybrid materialism, 4E cognition, embodiment, posthumanism, and all those things. This is the moment when system and cognition and humans became hybridized, right? When they became one, so to speak. And now after 2020, we have a new phase again, which is exactly marked by your own finding of homologies. This is again something new, because with these homologies you get some sort of substantialization again into this. It's not everything it's not contingent anymore. You see my point. It's not chaotic, but all of a sudden you have a certain logic. You have strange connections between different fields, which seem to be how should I say?
So you're saying I'm far ahead of my time.
Yeah, if you would have written my book 10 years ago, then you would be fine. You're just in the beginning of the new time, so to speak. So your thinking, my thinking is exactly the expression of this new thinking building up on the previous knowledge. So we are exactly the expression of this new generation.
And so this book is published in 2019?
Yeah. As I said, unfortunately, in German only.
But I'd be interested to read it.
How can I stop this now? Okay, so I didn't want to be annoying or but I just thought this would be interesting for you to know.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the reasons why I can say all this is because Ulrich Bröckling, who you mentioned earlier, is kind of a known, German sociologist, and I started this work like, I don't know, 10 years ago. This was like the climax maybe of this self-optimization movement, and then we started to think with Foucault about what does it mean, self-optimization with smartphones, tracking yourself, self-tracking, and all these things. And Yeah, so we started with this a little bit earlier and coming from a little bit of a different direction, but you see we are converging on the same results and problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to read that and maybe talk about it at some point.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting for you. I'm not guaranteeing that you will like everything, but
I don't have to.
It's actually against Luhmann, so to speak.
Okay.
Because Luhmann is, as I showed you earlier, like he's the concretization of this second
wave,
second wave, and so there are problems. But I understand, of course, that you would try to use them, right, to show these things. Okay, it's so. Yeah,
because I mean, Luhmann is very problematic, but also I think still extremely useful. And actually, I register a kind of, I guess my dissertation is also trying to push back against a certain tendency that I think is present in social theory, but maybe theory more broadly. Which kind of tends to think, well, look, we had closure, right? We had the Frankfurt School with the total administration of society and so on. But now actually we have these totally deterritorialized, flux of stuff that is total hybridity. There's no, sometimes even, people tend to think there's no distinctions even between, for instance, society and ecology. And what I think is useful with Luhmann, even though you don't have to take him in totally, but I think it's useful to think about a kind of real break between an inside and outside, and then to relate them again through paradoxical relations. And that allows you to see both things. It allows you to see distinction, and yet it also allows you to think non-linearly and complexly and interestingly the relation between them. And so I try to explore really that tension that I think that I think he's elaborated quite nicely. So I don't know if that would be anachronistic or anything, but I don't know whether that should be the point also, but that could be also a really interesting thing to think about, or something I definitely do think about also. But yeah, no need to revive Luhmann completely, but because he can be quite strict, I think, also with like society's 13 systems or something, and that's it. And he can be kind of limiting unnecessarily, I think. But it would be lovely to talk about that further at some point.
Yeah. Okay.
I think Katerina Kolosova is putting something important in the chat, which is that one of our next speakers is actually going to be Davor, who will hopefully then present. Yeah, well, maybe you don't know it yet, but yes, you will be one of our next speakers.
He knows it. We just haven't agreed on the date. Otherwise,
there you go.
That's why I put cautiously, hopefully on the 28th. But you agreed, Davor. So
yeah, okay.
You said yes.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
This will hopefully then also allow you to explain the use of your word generativity, because that's, in my work I use this word precisely because it has this double meaning, which is basically also what this conversation between you, Davor, and you, Jan, led to. So Jan, just to give you the last word in a way, is there anything you would like to say in terms of like looking back at this particular seminar? That is there a takeaway message that you want to kind of convey, or that you got from the discussion, so that we can close off this session?
Yeah, I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the session. I'm really, really thankful that everyone came and listened and asked very good and exciting questions. So that, first of all, as a final word, I mean, maybe, again, what I'm personally interested in or kind of just fascinated by is a kind of paradoxical logic, and to see what happens when you track or sort of draw out paradoxes and how they maybe weirdly constitute the social. Again, with this kind of artificial life software program, there's simple rules and they generate complex behavior, and we can see that somehow in a lot of places. So that's what I've been trying to do, I guess. So thanks again, Iris, and the school.
So thank you also from me on behalf of Adam, Katerina, Vera, Saskia, Zach, Rieste, and hopefully many others. This was a very nice, informative session. I think we all learned a lot. We did broadcast this on YouTube. So for those of you who want to kind of rewatch either yourself or the discussion, go to YouTube. Later this week, there will be another session, actually tomorrow. And I invite you all to look at the website and follow us, not only Jan, but also the school on social media. Have a good evening, have a good day, depending on your time zone. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jan.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Iris. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.